Really cool. So if I oh dear.
Good afternoon. My name is Tom Byrne. I'm president of the Korea Society, as I think most of you know by now. We are very happy to welcome you to today's program, Korea-Japan Relations Looking Back, Looking Forward. We welcome University of Connecticut history professor Alexis Dudden, author of Troubled Apologies Among Japan, Korea, and the United States. Together with Korea Society's Senior Director Stephen Noerper, Professor Dudden will discuss recent developments and take a look at what lies ahead in Korea-Japan relations. We've examined this important issue from multiple angles, and today's session represents a continuation of this effort here at the Korea Society's policy program. Before I turn the proceedings over to Stephen, I would invite you to please welcome Professor Dudden with a warm round of applause.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Alexis, for making the effort to join us again. I'll return in just a second to that. But also by way of introduction, we wanted to note, and some of you who have been to our webpage may have seen, that this week we are honoring the passing of a longtime board member, Lise Nider, who was married to Richard Snyder, former ambassador to the Republic of Korea. And Lee was a great thought leader in her own right and a great contributor in particular in the areas of Korean arts and Japanese arts. And she served the society nobly and very generously. We have a nice selection of ceramics, which she donated over a few years back, and some of which were on exhibition here in 2014, actually in our prior location. And she was particularly known for an exhibition on Korean folk paintings and related objects that appeared in the early 1980s called Auspicious Spirits, which opened in New York and then was seen around the country and was really, at that time, the largest exhibition to date of Korean folk paintings. But she really was quite gifted in art and antiquities and made a huge impact on the field and to those of us here at the Korea Society. Some of you may have been with us when we had her husband, Rudd Potes, here as well, and we're always grateful for his generosity and extend our deepest condolences to Rudd and to her son Dan and family. This, by the way, is available on Podcast Decision in Korea, which was Rudd's work when he was the bureau chief in Tokyo for United Press International. It's really the first history of the Korean War. It was done in 1954. He quite humbly describes it as a reporter's account, but do see our program that we had with him online, or you can pick it up through e-copy as well. But in Lee's memory and her dedication to the peoples of Korea and Japan, we thank and honor her. Also, I should note that this is the latest in a series that we're doing on Korea-Japan relations. And some of you may have been with us in the fall when we had Sheila Smith from the Council on Foreign Relations and Ambassador Tom Hubbard, the former chairman of the Korea Society. In our Kim Koo Professional Series in November, we had Katrin Katz, formerly of the National Security Council, and teaching on Korea-Japan relations at Georgetown University at the time. She's now up at Columbia University. And John Park also commented on December on some aspects. But Alexis, wonderful to have you here. And you were last with us in the wake of what was then kind of a flaring dispute over Dokdo. You talked with us about respective nationalisms at the time and about the prospects for maritime cooperation. And you're back today, and we're in a different place after a very hard year, to say the least, in Korea-Japan relations, and one where I'm hoping to get with you today to an idea of if we're seeing at least some possible warming, especially in the wake of the recent meeting between Moon Jae-in and Prime Minister Abe, and whether President Moon, Prime Minister Abe meeting speaks of a potential breakthrough, that coming on the wake of the meeting of Prime Minister Lee with Prime Minister Abe, and something of a backing off, it seems, on the economic issues. And so where do you see the state of the bilateral relations now?
Well, obviously, I wish I could predict the future. And thank you very much, and thank you all for coming to discuss these issues today. And I'm also really grateful that you put this in context of the last time I was here, which was described at the time as the worst relations had ever been. And often that's part of the problem, is each time there's a flare-up, it's described in superlative negative. And it's been a very bad year. Don't get me wrong, and we'll turn to that. But I'd like also to introduce, in a larger perspective, until 1998, you couldn't buy Japanese popular culture in Seoul, right? And so you couldn't go into Kyobo bookstore and have the giant display of anime, manga, and in Japanese. And so we've come a long way since 1998 if you talk about soft power exchange in that venue. And so I think, for example, the talks that I guess just happened today, the working level talks, which agreed in principle to try to encourage student exchange, civil society exchange. I think those are good signs. The problem is it's in the middle of this viral outbreak, which if we shift, and I don't mean to make light of that at all, rather when we see a real crisis, the coronavirus, hit the region, it's all the more imperative that Japan and South Korea figure out how to work together, and that we figure out ways that the societies that have the best available medicine, for example, excellent researchers, can work together communally. The downside is it's not a great time to send students on airplanes back and forth to one another. So where are we now? I thought it was a very good step that Prime Minister Abe returned to the language of the closest neighbor with shared values, for example, in his opening speech of the year. And I think, President Moon has made clear that he is really willing to try a number of avenues. So at least we've departed from the bottom of last July, which unfortunately needs also to be seen in the context of summer vacation. Everybody had a lot of time to be on the streets and hate each other on chat rooms or on the streets. And so we're in the winter now, which is a bad time to protest outside. So it's the moment for coming up with creative ideas, I think, is there. And maybe to build on this new proposal to encourage student exchange, one way to do that might be to set up online chat rooms. Government-backed ones, so that it's not vitriolic, out of control hate, for example. But I do think that the real standoff of August was deeply unfortunate because of the absence of the United States saying anything helpful. And I really, this year I've really felt my responsibility as an American citizen, because our country can't simply sit back and say, oh, well, just, it doesn't matter if you two are slinging mud at each other. It does matter, and we see that with the GSOMIA discussion, et cetera. But little did most of us on the outside know what was consuming Washington in August. We now know, but it didn't make sense, actually, why Washington wasn't helpfully entering the room. And now I honestly, on that front, I don't know who would be helpful and what would be helpful. But I do think real coordination between the three, not just the two, is pushing things forward again. I hope so.
Sure. So if we look at last year in something of a snapshot, we seem to have a situation where things began on the export control, again, sort of through the late spring and early summer. And then there was the removal from the respective white lists, the trade preference lists. There seemed to be a bit of a break with the August 15th speech. President Moon was, while firm in some aspects, also inviting in terms of a better relationship. Then to jump ahead to GSOMIA, the concern that South Korea would pull itself out of that agreement with Japan, but both Tokyo and Seoul agreeing at the very last minute and with a very strong input from Washington to go ahead and take a pause. And it seems that was done out of deference to Washington, but also perhaps part of the early calculus of the special measures agreement negotiations, right? Wanting things to be good between the United States and Korea as well. Some deference and maybe an implied trade-off there. And then we have these meetings, the prime ministerial meetings, the prime minister and the president meetings. Some backing off of the boycotts, which were flaring at the summer point, as you mentioned, and through the fall. Do you think that there is there a growing ground for trust? Is it too early to say that?
See, that's where working from the ground up needs to happen again. And I think it's been a deeply unfortunate year in both societies of really ramping up the racial assaults on the other. And if you go through online blog spheres, et cetera, but also very on the surface, the Nagoya art exhibition, for example, which was it was supposed to be a really positive Japanese effort to put difficult topics on display, only to immediately become another fight over the truth of the comfort women. And then to have the government officials in Japan voice their weight on the side of denial and erasure. And so that's where this is really difficult, because as we well know, we can never separate history from the questions of Japan-Korea relations. And when officials on both sides fan those fires, then they get out of control in the streets. When you've got the actual assault in Seoul of a young Japanese woman, yes, that the man has now been punished. And at the same time, in his New Year's address, Aso Taro took the opportunity once again to say that Japan was a homogenous race and had been for 2,000 years, which is a dog whistle to anti-Korean sentiment in Japan. And so it's, the moment begs for a leader to just take Japanese society out of hating Koreans as the default mechanism, which is the easiest way to gain votes. And that's really, unfortunately, what happened in July last year. There was a snap election. Abe just, thought, okay, we'll bring out the anti-Korean card. And it is that facile at some level. And then the problem is it created this economic standoff, which may, ultimately benefit South Korea's distribution system better. The idea that it was totally reliant on certain Japanese corporations has shown to be short-sighted. So, in the long run, that could be better for the South Korean economy. But in the mix, the plummeting levels in tourism, the plummeting levels of products and things that really are one way to bring these societies together, the things that hadn't been there prior to 1998, for example.
Sure.
And so this is, I personally am not a big fan of soft power analysis, but I really think that this is the best moment for that kind of promotion.
On
take
the
the lead.
electoral card issue first, so we had, I'll be going into that snap election, and clearly he got the result that he wanted, bottom line. Now we have National Assembly elections in Korea coming up on April 15th. To what degree do you see the calculation relative to domestic politics in Korea?
Well, I think it's going to inform these elections quite a lot, and I think that that's where the question of how best to atone for slave labor and forced labor rests primarily in the hands of Japan, and at the same time, to turn it into a domestic political issue will only make it more difficult for there to be any sort of state-to-state resolution. And again, of course, since Japan says it's already taken care of everything, it could be whipped farther. But that's where, again, forward thinking, and I did think President Moon's August address was quite balanced, and so many pieces of historical documentation have come out since, largely also in conjunction with Japanese researchers working with Korean researchers, and highlighting those efforts might help. Will it change the election tenor? Does it? I mean, it's tricky, right? Because obviously it's an easy card to use in South Korean politics as well. So I can't see that going smoothly, and I think the proposal that South Korean corporations share the responsibility with Japanese corporations does run the risk of becoming similar to what happened to several comfort women agreements. So.
We did, in terms of avenues, then the second part of what you had to say, avenues of cooperation. Clearly in the soft power area, the sociocultural, the interaction on economic fronts. And we should point out that the large business organizations in both Seoul and Tokyo got together in the fall in Seoul and issued a fairly strong statement about the bottom line impact of this. And then beyond that, in reference to the military sharing agreement and the idea to postpone the cutoff, is that with North Korea's missile testing and concerns about nuclear development, that actually forces the two together in terms of some degree of common security concern, although they may be at different points relative to the proclivities of the administrations on how to engage North Korea. But clearly that when Japan and South Korea have worked best together, there seems to have been some push factors, either a security concern or economic issues, as we saw in 2008, and as we saw earlier in the wake of 1998 and the warming period that took place under Kim Dae-jung. So if we consider that, and then now the coronavirus issue, where you have very active and excellent health communities in both South Korea and Japan. And of course, there's a lot of shared research now as we're trying to address this. And then as we look ahead toward the Olympics, which in recent days, there have been concerns raised about the effect of the coronavirus and the follow through on the games. And Prime Minister Abe has said, no, indeed, as of this point, everything is full steam ahead. But clearly, this being the second of the Northeast Asia Games, the first being Pyeongchang in 2018, this Tokyo 2020, and then Beijing 2022 for the Winter Games. How do all of these factors, kind of come together? We've sort of got a fairly rich mosaic of potential areas for cooperation. And I'm wondering if those then don't become off-ramps from the tensions of last year.
Well, I think when you put it very well, that Japan and South Korea can work together very well when there's a perceived third element against which they need to join together, and I think it would be best for the region to not continue to have that be North Korea's provocations. And this in no way is I'm in no way trying to apologize for North Korea's behavior. At the same time, I do believe in an engaged approach, which I know is not everybody's cup of tea, but I am a pacifist realist, and I do believe that engagement with North Korea is in Northeast Asia's benefit, not just Korea's benefit. And that's really clearly, I mean, the Trump administration approach has clearly thrown Japan for a loop. I mean, that is abundantly clear. Moon Jae-in's approach is not surprising, but the fact that the Trump administration sided with that approach, at least at the beginning, threw that for a loopy. But we don't see Japan coming together with South Korea to make that happen under this Japanese administration. And this Japanese administration is going to be there for a while. So I think to return to the coronavirus, which is a deeply unfortunate trend, but this would be an avenue to promote high-level cooperations amongst the ministries of health between two societies that have deep involvement with Chinese medical researchers as well, and something that really could showcase cooperation between the two health communities. As you say, again, we're really kind of not grasping at straws here, but if we're going to try to show avenues of cooperation, this would be a great one. Because it is easy to see how the societies fracture, and they're going to continue to fracture over history with Prime Minister Abe in charge, because that is his sure ticket to staying in charge. I mean, just based on his support group, his personal writings. And so there's not a lot to hope for in overcoming historical disputes. And so the more South Korean administration would push on that, that will only further divide. So again, it would be wonderful if that were different. It's not going to be different under the Abe administration. So again, take advantage of something that South Korea and Japanese high-level officials can work together on. The Olympics, as you say, I think South Korea has pulled back a bit from focusing on the dangers of Fukushima, and I think that that's wise. That is to say, I don't think there is anything safe about Fukushima, personally, from my own research, and I'm happy to go down that avenue later. But I think it's wonderful that the South Korean soccer team is doing really well and looking forward to Tokyo, and the language of sport there is definitely hopeful. The problem is the coronavirus may be out of control, and it may be best to postpone these Olympics. That's for many other people other than me to decide. I understand the economics involved make that sort of silly to say, but it's a reality that needs to be considered.
In terms of political leadership, and I know you've just said it's probably an administration that will be in for a while, but post 2021, or as you look down the pipe, I mean, are there areas where you see potential, the young Koizumi or others who may have a line that is bent in a more conciliatory way?
Sure, that's an excellent question. And again, I can't predict Japanese politics either, but it's really interesting to see the trajectory of Kono Taro. For example, he was foreign minister when the brouhaha began last summer. Now he's defense minister. He's also the son of the Kono of Kono statement, a man who engaged with Korea. So it's noticeable and not particularly surprising that to position his own base, he's come out very anti-Korean. And that's been consistent this year. Conversely, other arguably maybe more conservative contenders, Ishiba, for example, seem to be approaching a more engaged future. Koizumi Jr., sure. I mean, he's a wild card and is very popular. And I think I wish I were a cartoonist, because I could see Kono Taro over in the corner going, sort of like, how come he gets to do it and I don't? But he's got a telegenic appeal, and it is certainly in his son's interest. He's just had a son. It's in his son's interest to have a Japan engaged with East Asia, beginning with good relations with South Korea. As environmental minister, that's that's another avenue of cooperation, right? I don't describe myself as a Korea or Japan person. I describe myself as somebody who works on the ocean that has no name in between.
Sure.
And I think that is something that, focus on environment, focus on the horrible amount of plastic in that ocean, work together in ways that are deeply historical, have been what brought people from the continent in ancient history to the place we now call Japan. But again, that's a historian's pipe dream, is to constantly remind people we always are together. But in real life, real time, there are several issues. Again,
Demographics, the grain of both societies too.
Absolutely.
Would seem to come to
And so again, that's where leadership matters. So I have been at least heartened that Prime Minister Abe himself has toned down the rhetoric against Korea, but it would be beneficial to take a more forward-looking view and not simply repeat the same circular ideas.
Sure. I have two more questions, then we'll turn to the audience. One, now that we've talked about leadership, popular perception, because one thing we have seen in the last year and a half is, to some surprisingly large percentages of the population really doubting the other, which is something rather stark. And so how do you think reshaping, or is that a product of visionary leadership that moves a polity along?
No, I mean, movies are the best, right? I mean, sharing movies, especially since, I think now through the eyes of my 14-year-old. So, just if it can be held on a telephone and watched, it introduces a new society. All Parasite all the time, right? I mean, just like have all of these. Yeah. This is a wonderful way into South Korean society. I don't have to preach that here. It's a great movie. Have many showings all over Japan.
Bong Joon-ho, by the way, the Academy Award nominated director for Parasite, said at the Korea Society, when I asked him about his influences, without a pause, he said, Kurosawa.
Absolutely.
Kurosawa was my primary
then have
so
ministries of cultures, and then, but I was going to say, together with a wide display of Koreeda's movies, for example. And so he was in Busan recently, right, and he won an award. But really promote things that get at deeper levels of both societies. And obviously, K-pop and Super Mario are what most people want, but more difficult, but not over the top difficult. Doesn't have to be completely highbrow stuff, right? But I just think the more visible that regular daily life in both societies can become to the other, the better chance of some rapprochement, because this summer was a doozy, and especially this fall. And I'm not really just talking about beer sales, right?
Sure.
I'm just talking about the absence of engagement.
Let me wrap up our discussion with a question that you spoke to in response to the first, which was U.S. role. And clearly, there are a lot of Americans, many here in this room, listening or viewing online, who care a lot about both Japan and Korea. We've vibrant, crucial bilateral relations between Washington and Tokyo and Washington and Seoul. And Washington desperately wants good and strong trilateral coordination, especially given concerns about North Korea and other issues in the region, China's rise, et cetera. And they want that. Democratic values, a lot of things that bring them together, liberal economies. A lot of complementarity there, enormous markets, and the people-to-people relations. The administration is hesitant, and it's not just this administration, but American government in general is hesitant about getting in between the two. And they very clearly, this administration has made the point over the fall that they don't want to do that. And so what they have done is quietly offer assurances in both Tokyo and Seoul, and we did see a lot of activity on the diplomatic front, defense state, in the fall, but also clear statements that the U.S. and this administration didn't want to broker. One of my suggestions at the time was providing stages for a convening mechanism, if not a mediation mechanism. And there have been sidebar meetings of the leaders and senior officials. So what do you think as the realist part of your equation there? What do you think are the real possibilities where the U.S. can play a positive, constructive role in encouraging Seoul and Tokyo to come together?
The million-dollar question. We really do need to be honest about how we, the United States, sustain these divisions. I do believe this by punting on very hot-button topics of history, such as predominantly the territorial dispute. By continuing to say, we'll let you work it out for yourselves, completely denies the American role in creating this problem. And I realize that that is highly unlikely to happen, but it would be very beneficial if the State Department could possibly revisit the terms of the San Francisco Treaty to understand why this continues to be such a problem, because when it becomes a flashpoint, and I actually thought one of the most dangerous things happened last summer when the Russian flight just sort of toyed with both sides to see if the United States would come to anybody's rescue. And the U.S. stayed out of it, but that was a very dangerous moment. Far, in my humble opinion, far more dangerous than beating up a Toyota or not drinking Japanese beer ultimately is. So the United States really needs to understand that China and Russia actually enjoy playing with those little islands. And if the United States could understand that in the San Francisco Treaty, we purposely inserted ourselves, well, actually, John Foster Dulles, who wrote the treaty, purposely inserted the United States in perpetuity in this problem. But this problem could be better seen not simply by having United States maps continue to refer to it from its Liancourt Rock name, for example, and say, this is something that we can't mediate because we created the mess. But some honesty about the United States' involvement in creating issues that continue to flare. The issue of labor, again, that is going to be best worked out ultimately through education. And so it would be beneficial again here to have American officials be better educated about why these tensions continue to linger instead of just having the ad hoc, work it out for yourselves, work it out for yourselves. Because since 1945, the United States has been on every page of these negotiations, whether or not the photo of the American is there. And that is most definitely seen in the negotiations for the 1965 treaty, which are part of this current problem. So again, talk about the biggest pipe dream is American honesty right now and American leadership, and that's my humble opinion, but we need a State Department that is functioning and taking the lead and not just running around ordering people. It's a tricky moment, right? We don't even really have an ambassador in Tokyo. We have an ambassador who has infuriated the South Korean public in South Korea, and we don't actually seem to have a policy statement of where we want things to go. And so, again, this is a very tricky moment to answer your question of what should the United States do. The United States should do what it should do, which is come up with a plan for a functioning policy that brings Northeast Asia together rather than continue to divide it, because that is not to anybody's benefit.
But by way of footnote, in a very good book that Tom Plate, the former LA Times journalist now teaching at Loyola Marymount, put together called Conversations with Ban Ki-moon, former Secretary General Ban said the most important relationship to get right in East Asia is the Korea-Japan relationship. And there goes not only Northeast Asia, but the East Asia region at large. So Alexis Dudden, thank you very much. And let us turn now to the audience for comments, questions. Please just identify yourself as you address Professor Dudden. Thank you. Anyone like to lead off?
I'm not scary. Come on.
I'm Dr. Shin from South Korea, and we already suggest and also request some mediation between two countries, Japan and Korea. Last summer, our opponent party's leader asked the American representative to mediate to the countries, but since then, no answers from the United States. Also, you already mentioned that, but would you tell me more details of what's the position of the United States between the conflicts of two countries?
Well, I am not at all a United States official, and so I would never presume to speak for the American government. But as an American citizen, I think that it's imperative to recognize that if we are asking our allies to host our troops, then we need to treat them with dignity and not brand them as dependents on us. And we also perhaps should not make such enormous requests for burden sharing if we actually are treating our mutual allies with respect. And I do find it interesting that, essentially the United States made an equivalent request of Japan. The Japanese government just kept a much tighter lid on that conversation and continues to do so. What would be really helpful? Maybe because the United States in some ways is a little dysfunctional at the moment, maybe appealing to European nations, which technically have nothing to do with this relation. So I understand that that won't carry the weight, but perhaps work together with London, with an ally that is strong, but is not a security ally, but one with, has relations with both, just to talk about history in a third setting, something, a different space. Another ally during World War II that was part of the treaty that's created so many difficulties, for example, or Australia, a nation that both countries seem to get along with well. And that's where, what is the common future envisaged for the region should be the question, I think. And if the common future is really thought about carefully, climate change, right? I mean, I'm glad that you brought up Ban Ki-moon, because when the doomsday clock was moved horrendously to 100 seconds to midnight last week, Ban Ki-moon gave a very powerful address, at once noting that North Korea's provocations were elemental to why that doomsday clock moved forward, but also noting the need for a common understanding of climate change, that this really was as great a threat to the future of not just the region, but the planet. And so again, shifting the discourse a little bit away from only North Korea missiles as the threat, but maybe climate issues, something that again would bring Koizumi, but there is so much in common, and I'm not talking about history here. There's so much in common between Korea and Japan that is absolutely begins with how we live our lives. You mentioned demographics, but the rising heat in both countries, these things. The current Washington does not believe in climate change, so that's the wrong country to turn to for this issue. So again, our European allies, which accept science, might be a way to have common conversations. But again, I personally wish we had different leadership in Washington at the moment that could address this problem. We don't, so we need to move somewhere else.
Yeah, that's the point. Is we need that kind of some leading the third-party countries such as the United States. So we expect the United States to play the critical role to make us a harmony between two countries with some subject of environment themes or anything else. So that's why with the Korea-United Alliance and also the United States and Japan alliance, also they are expecting some kind of roles from the United States.
Sure, and this is the pacifist part of me. I get it. It doesn't make sense. Japan and South Korea have the United States as a military guarantor. So it has to be the United States on the one hand. On the other hand, there's some very interesting Japanese parliamentarians, for example, who have said, well, what is the purpose of our military, the Japanese military? And they argue that, well, of course, Japan has a military, but does it have to be a military that fights America's wars? Or could this be the United Nations' true climate change force? And again, this may sound very strange, but it's actually a brilliant idea. We've seen in moments of pandemic, in moments of tsunami, that this requires a militarized response. What a great idea for Japan. And it would, are there things that could take that conversation seriously among Japanese people, but among Korean and Japanese together? Have a joint task force set up that rescues the Philippines from the latest typhoon, for example. And again, this may all sound very like, well, that's never going to happen on the one hand. On the other hand, we are clearly facing a very, very different future to walk into. And so I do think it's incumbent on changing the words we're using. History happened. We have a lot of documents to prove what some people say didn't happen. And one of the most interesting documents, for example, that has arisen in recent months over the forced labor dispute was in the Hankyoreh about a month or so ago, and it's a condolence letter from a Japanese corporation to the family of the Korean forced to labor in the 1940s. His name is changed to a Japanese name, but it's a very clear acknowledgement that this man was forcibly in a different place from his hometown. So we really are only increasing the materiality of the history, but we still haven't changed the conversation towards the future we all keep saying we want to make better. So this is where I would encourage us to think about things that we don't really usually talk about, such as climate change, such as other sorts of crises that actually affect East Asia every year with greater frequency. The weather is getting worse, and I think we can say that.
Yeah, and by way of footnote to that, if we think of more modern history, in 2011, when Japan suffered, the first foreign volunteers came from Korea. Right? The first boots on the ground to help were Korean citizens. And so, there is a more modern history of some cooperation and common sympathies and sharing.
And I do think,
give way to that.
And this summer's Olympics are a continuation of that effort. I really do think it's in South Korea's interests not to keep poking at the Fukushima button, because Fukushima is a disaster. No doubt about it. But it doesn't need to be a political disaster. The people who are living there already know what they are living with. So I think if governments sort of pull back on that, unless there is an international movement to urge Japan not to host the torch relay in Fukushima, that would be wise, but that should not come from South Korea, I think, because good games, positive games are only way to get people moving in the right direction.
Right, and I think as we see the Tokyo Games, whether they occur as scheduled or more delayed. And remember, the 1964 Tokyo Games actually were fall games.
Absolutely.
So there is a precedent.
It was too hot then.
But I know Korea would very much like Japan's endorsement to the IOC on the idea of the 2032 bid. And so there is a lot of reason to have cooperation.
Yes, and it's deeply unfortunate that at this moment of possibility in inter-Korean engagement, we have a sort of very feckless Washington and a Japanese administration that desperately does not want the two Koreas to get along. And so this is a historical moment that I wish I had a lot more power.
Please.
Thank you. I'm Charlie Kimball. I'm with the Korea Center for International Finance. You discussed how burden sharing problems with the United States didn't bring South Korea and Japan together. Is it possible that if the United States administration decides that auto imports are a national security issue, that could bring the two together, that they might jointly file a complaint to the WTO or something else?
I think that's an excellent question, and I would actually like to learn from you because I have another question that relates to that. Given that the supply chains from Chinese parts are clearly going to be problematic to Japanese car makers and South Korean car makers, is this I mean, again, I definitely don't want to jump up and down and make the Chinese situation worse for China, but is this a moment in which Japan and South Korea actually should be working together, precisely as you say, in the auto parts world this way? Because, I mean, we're already reading reports from Toyota saying we have to not count on this future shipment kind of thing. Do you know anything about this? Because I think it's an excellent possibility for them to get together.
No, I don't know anything specific, but a difference would be that they are competitors in terms of shipping automobiles to the United States. And, you know, if there are shortages in Chinese parts, it's hard for me personally to imagine that a Korean company would supply
A Japanese,
those
yeah, sure.
parts to a Japanese company,
Yeah.
you know, without facing some, at least publicity about why aren't you supplying to the Koreans, companies that have similar shortages.
Yeah, no, I
That's
mean,
my take on it. I don't know.
Charlie, we have a lot of American supply companies too.
yeah, we do. No, I mean, it throws, you know, when one drives to Newark Airport right now, and the stacks and stacks of truckloads of material come up because they haven't been going to China in the trade war, but then all of a sudden we have this unforeseen reality shifting the conversation. So I agree with you about the nature of competition. I just wonder how it's going to play out. But
Please, a few more questions?
My name is Willy from the UN Pension Fund, but I'm here as a just private citizen. My question is that a couple years ago, this Financial Times editor, David Pilling, wrote a book called Bending Adversity, Japan and the Art of Survival. And for me, the biggest takeaway he had in that book was there was a quote saying, Japan has never had a Willy Brandt moment. So in 1970, when Willy Brandt, the West German chancellor, went to Warsaw and bowed down, it's the Nifal von Warschen, to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. He bowed down, and it was an act of such humility that it really won the hearts of a lot of Poles, and it really helped improve German-Poland relationships. We've never had that, and that really struck me. And my question is, why hasn't Japan had a Willy Brandt moment? And just to add, a couple of years ago, when Prime Minister Abe visited Harvard Kennedy School, there was a Korean American student who asked him directly about the comfort women and Japanese government involvement in it. And Prime Minister Abe deflected the question. He just expressed remorse to the individual, the individual who suffered, without addressing that question at all. So my question is, why can't Japan acknowledge that? And there's still a lot of right-wing elements in the Ministry of Education in Japan, and I think if those elements are removed and these issues of history can be confronted with a more honest look, it would really help to improve Korea-Japan relations.
I agree. But I actually, and David's a friend. I like the book very much. I'm not sure I totally agree with that there hasn't been a similar moment. It just isn't recognized as such. And I'm thinking of, what is the correct way of saying the now retired emperor? I'm not even sure what the correct title should be. Now retired Emperor Akihito in 2005 when he went to Saipan. And he wrote a poem that was to recognize all who had died in the war, not just Japanese. And it really opened a very different conversation among some people about what that meant. And Korea remains the only country of the former empire that Akihito was not able to visit. So again, I'm not a monarchist. I don't think that the emperor should be used politically. That's about as political as he could get. And it would be important, I think, for there to be made more of that moment. The problem is the right wing in Japan doesn't necessarily like that, which leads me to what I do think is important to think about in the context of the current Korea-Japan issue, is that Japan is, in my thinking, more divided than even the United States right now. Japan is a very divided society in a way that I wasn't alive during the Meiji moment, but they're very similar calls for either a renewal, meaning, take it back to a kind of emperor as head of state. The proposals, for example, that the Abe administration has put out for not just revising the Constitution, but writing an entire new Constitution, are very much a totally different Japan on the ground. But that hasn't been able to go forward because there's the other Japan, which we just don't hear, because the Abe voice has sucked the microphone, as it were, and it's very difficult to get a sense of this other Japan, which is as, if not more, a percentage of the population, but is also the reason, as a historian, that I have access to any documents, is my colleagues in Japan. And my colleagues in Korea work with our colleagues in Japan, and we get the materials. I brought some in case nobody believed me. We have the lists of former sex slaves of the Japanese military. We have the lists of the estimated low number, 800,000 forced labor, that Japanese scholars have found. And so recognizing that this is very much as Japanese as Prime Minister Abe is Japanese is elemental to what we mean when we say Japan today. Japan has a vibrant democracy. We just don't get to hear from it. And the fact that there was this art exhibition in Nagoya this summer that went so horribly wrong began with efforts by Japanese art promoters, museum curators, and journalists to bring things that are considered taboo in Japanese society on display. And that is very much, the fact that it got shut down is the other Japan. So again, I would encourage us understanding the divisions in Japanese society are really key to the future of Northeast Asia. And this isn't just bringing Hatoyama Yukio's vision for an East Asia together back in the conversation. That needed a lot of work, but it's noticeable that there are very prominent Japanese leaders who constantly talk about the need to engage with East Asia writ large, the areas of the former empire seen as a whole. So I would put that to you, and that's all with due respect to bending it. I think it's a great book. So, but
Do I have a final question, please?
Thank you. My name is Kyocha. I'm with the United Nations, but I'm here in my private capacity too. It's actually a very similar question to the gentleman who asked about the Willy Brandt moment.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like one of the most fundamental questions we have regarding Korea-Japan relations is really the quality of the apology. This is something that when I speak to Koreans of a certain generation, they would say, well, we can't move forward until they really apologize, to which the Japanese will say, we already issued an apology, what more do you want? But Koreans of a certain generation, they don't feel that the apology was sincere. It's a qualified apology, or the apology is undercut by some of the comments they make that justify the occupation and so forth. So my question is, what kind of apology do you think would satisfy the Koreans, and what's politically feasible for the Japanese to issue?
So I don't think there ever will be a final apology, because I don't think that's the point of asking for an apology. I think one thing the Japanese novelist Murakami Haruki said a couple years ago, actually it was in the context of China-Japan relations, but it certainly pertains to Korea-Japan relations. He said, let people ask for an apology over and over again, and we should apologize over and over again until people stop asking. And so there is a burden on the perpetrator state. And there is a need for state responsibility, which has always been avoided. There have been, I can't remember as of today, I believe there have been 28 apologies by different governing officials since the early 1990s. But there's always a backtrack, right? And so, and it was just seen as recently as Prime Minister Abe says something nice towards Korea, and his number two man also says, well, we're a homogenous race and we always have been. So it's the push and pull that I think is always noticeable when it's not backed up in education. And that's really where I think the change will eventually come. But as was noted earlier, Japanese textbooks have taken a turn backwards. And there's really no other word to use it, because if one were in sixth grade in 2003, the textbooks were pretty good. And there was a lot about atrocities committed and things that Koreans want included in the textbooks. But if one is in sixth grade today, those topics have been removed. And as a teacher, I know students don't do their homework. So the point is not actually what the kid is reading, but the textbook is a measure of what the state wants as required knowledge. And so it's put the onus on the sixth grade teacher, for example. That sixth grade teacher, it's not illegal to teach your sixth grade students about militarized sexual slavery. You just have to bring all of the materials into your classroom on your own, which in an age of cell phones is immediately going to go viral, and that teacher is going to risk being, out of a job. So in that respect, it's a really unfortunate catch-22. The knowledge is there. The will by many Japanese to atone, and again, I'm not really sure what word is best. A full kowtow by the emperor towards the continent is probably not going to happen, because that would politicize the emperor. But a full kowtow towards the continent and areas in the Nanyo, as it were, the South Ocean, of a prime minister would be great in the Willy Brandt model. I don't see that happening based on what is currently being taught in Japanese education. So in the meantime, focus by Koreans on efforts made at the civil society level. I think the most impressed 2 years ago, I attended many of the Wednesday sit-ins for the former comfort women. And there were 3 women from Japan who had been teaching themselves enough Korean to be able to apologize to Koreans that they met. These were 3 housewives from suburban Tokyo. They brought a big sign in Korean and Japanese, and they were standing there saying, "Only when we work together can we move forward." So I know it's not a state level, but there is this impetus among many Japanese who actually have learned what happened and want the countries to coexist. It's just a particularly unfortunate moment, not unique to Japan, right? We have nations, including mine, around the world that would like to build walls. And I live in a country that wants to spend my taxes on a wall against Mexico. And Japan, current leadership, wants to build a wall around the country, starting with Korea. And so it's a tricky moment to expect state responsibility, but as long as we keep asking for it, then eventually increasing amounts of efforts will come.
Alexis, you have a book forthcoming. Yeah?
I have a book that I am finishing.
Okay.
It's not quite hitting the press. It's called The Opening and Closing of Japan, 1850 to 2020. And I am following the advice of one of my favorite Japanese historians, Amino Yoshihiko, who said that the best way to understand Japan is to look at it from the sea. And in that, I'm arguing that a robust future for Japan is one that has border lines, not borders. And I believe that about many countries. And so I start with that, but thank you.
Okay. Alexis, lovely to have you back. Please join me in thanking Alexis Dudden.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I would like to invite all of you back for a few things upcoming. On April 3rd, we have a session on Chinese policy, foreign policy as directed toward the Korean Peninsula. I'll have Orville Shull here from the Asia Society. We'll have Yun Sun from the Stimson Center. So if you have time, please do join us on April 3rd. On April 17th, just after the Korean National Assembly elections, we'll have a readout from Ji Wook Shin of Stanford University here at noon. And on May 1st, we have David Kong from USC, who will be here to talk about defining a new Korea-US alliance and ways to enrich and deepen and renew that relationship. So we hope to see you back. And clearly, in the meantime, please do sign up for membership at koreasociety.org. I would like to take just a minute, in addition, to thank a few of the vital players here. We have Jonathan Corrado, who has handled all the logistics as our Director of Policy, Peter Stemke in our audio sound booth, and you can find this and all of our other programs up on audio podcast or via video. And to special thanks to our intern team here today, who has added a great deal as well. And I just wanted to mention in closing that I will mark my 10th year with the Korea Society tomorrow. And it has been a rich 10 years because I get to sit with people like Alexis and John Park, who some of you saw me with last. We had this opening of our policy season last week with Jonathan and some young journalists on North Korea. We had Tom Byrne in the adjacent room doing an economic roundtable on North Korea, Cuba, and creditworthiness. So we're doing a lot here, and we do really appreciate your support. And I'm very grateful to my colleagues here and to all of you. And it makes me very happy to look out and see Julia Quincy, one of my NYU graduates here. I was at NYU as an associate professor before I joined the Korea Society. So I'm very grateful to her. And to also see my new students from Columbia here. Thank you very much. And to all of you from where you come, from the United Nations, from media, from corporate, academia, or other policy circles, and to our members, we really appreciate your continued support. So thank you, and we'll see you next time around.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you, Alexis.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.